Imagine you're submerged in energy, qi, all around you. Gather the qi, let it float. Release it all around you. Gather back to your body, into your body. Let it sink all the way down. Right hand floats to the right, floats all the way up and expand. Shrinks, sinks down. Left foot, float, expand. Shrink, sink down. Float, expand. Circle all the way and then shrink back with your elbow leading. Float, sink, float, expand, shrink and floating, expand, sink, gather, release, float, shrink, float, gather, circle, release, gather, float, receive, and release, float, expand, sink, circle, expand, sink, expand, float, sink, circle, float, sink, float, circle, sink, float, sink, expand, gather, float, sink, float, circle, sink, float, sink, expand, sink, float, sink, gather, release, sink, float, sink, float, open, release, gather, release, sink, float, sink, float, open, release, gather, release. Once more, sink, float, sink, float, open, release, gather, release, turn, pierce, gather, circle, kick, float, sink, float, open, sink, float, punch down, float, sink, float, sink, open, open, expand, circle, reach, sink down, float, sink, float, shrink, expand, shrink, expand, release and sink, gather and open to your right, sink all the way down. Left hand, float, sink, float, shrink, float, gather, release, float and rotate, sink down. Fist sinks, float, rotate, rotate, receive, send, rotate, and sink. Here, sink, float, rotate, rotate, receive, send, rotate, sink. Fist sinks, float, rotate, rotate, gather, release, rotate, sink. Once more, sinks, float, rotate, rotate, gather, release, rotate, sink. Fist floats up, sinks, floats around and forward, sinks. Ward off, float, right hand float, circle around, float around, sinks, float, kick, sinks, expand, float, circle, circle, sinks, float, kick, sinks, circle, circle, gather, release, sink, expand, circle, circle, gather, release, sink, float, expand, sinks, expand, forward, come back, turn, float, sink, float, circle, sink, float, expand, forward and down, turn, swing, come back, expand forward and swing, come back, gather, step, release, sinks, gather, release, gather, step out, release, gather, release, turn, gather, release, turn, sinks, float, left kick, sinks, turn right, left hand flips and sinks, sinks, float and shrink and release, sink, turn left, right hand sinks, left hand sinks, float and gather, release, sink, float, sink, float, gather, gather, sink, expand, gather, release from your back, sinks, swing, come back, swing, gather, release, sinks, floats, sinks, circle, sink, float, sink, expand, sinks, expand, punch, expand, relax, expand, through, step back, shrink, gather, expand, sinks, floats, release all the way. From here, turn, left pierce, turn, kick. Here, expand, come back, step back, sinks, expand, release, expand, release, come back, expand, release, gather, release, gather, and sink all the way down as you release. And finished.